Shout at me again and this ends. The first thing Mira Hale noticed about the night court wasn't the candles. It was the silence that followed power. In the Velvet Crescent, a downtown restaurant where rich tourists came to feel important, people argued, laughed, snapped their fingers at servers. Loudness was normal there. Noise meant nothing. But when the black cars arrived at midnight and the entire street went still, Mira learned the truth. There was a kind of quiet that wasn't peace. It was fear, trained, practiced, inherited. The doorman froze mid-bow, the valet forgot how to breathe, and every human in sight lowered their eyes like the world had suddenly become sacred ground. The restaurant manager, Mr. Callow, transformed into a different person. His smile stretched too wide, his voice turned syrupy, his posture bent into submission. Mira didn't understand why. Not until she saw him. He entered like he owned the air. Tall. Perfect in a way that didn't feel human. His hair was dark silver, like moonlight trapped in metal. His coat was midnight black, stitched with a subtle pattern that shimmered when he moved. Something ancient, something ceremonial. And his eyes, storm gray. Not the gentle gray of a rainy morning. The sharp gray of iron right before it strikes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The entire restaurant bowed around him without anyone saying a word. Mr. Callow rushed forward. Your Grace, welcome. We're honored. Your table is prepared exactly as you requested. Your Grace? Myra's fingers tightened around the tray she was carrying. She was supposed to be on the back floor tonight, refilling water, wiping tables, staying out of trouble. But a server had called in sick, and Mr. Callow had thrown Mira into the front with a warning that still burned behind her ribs. Whatever you do, he'd whispered earlier, don't look at them. Don't speak unless spoken to. And if anything goes wrong, anything, remember you're replaceable. Replaceable. Mira had smiled like she didn't care. But inside, it had landed on every bruise her life had ever given her. She followed Mr. Callow's gaze now, watching the man, the king apparently, glide toward the private obsidian booth at the far end of the restaurant. That booth was never used. Not by celebrities. Not by wealthy families. It was sealed most nights like a shrine. Tonight it looked like a throne room disguised as luxury. Black glass table, dark velvet seating, candlelight reflected 100 times in mirrored surfaces. 2 men flanked him. One was thin and anxious, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles looked pale. The other walked like a predator, easy confidence, smiling as if secrets were a form of currency. The predator caught Myra's eyes for a half-second. He smiled wider, like he'd found something entertaining. Mr. Callow snapped his fingers in Myra's direction, sharp and impatient. Mira. Now. Move. The way he said her name was not a name. It was an order. Mira stepped forward, careful, shoulders straight, tray steady. Blood-red wine sat in crystal decanters, labeled Special Reserve on the menu. The manager had told her to treat them like holy objects. As she approached the booth, she heard voices. Not loud, but cutting. You don't understand optics, the predator said, voice smooth and amused. Your alliances are thinning. Your court is tired. The eastern houses are watching you misstep. The king's voice answered, quiet, cold, controlled. You confuse restraint with weakness, Dorian. So that was his name. Dorian. Mira didn't know why it made her uneasy, but it did, like the sound carried poison. The thin advisor cleared his throat. Your Grace, perhaps. Not now, the king said. The advisor fell silent immediately, like he'd been erased. Mira reached the table edge and angled the decanter. Pour smoothly. No spilling. No shaking. That was the job. That was survival. She began to pour and then. The king moved. Not toward her. Toward Dorian. A quick, frustrated gesture. His arm cutting the air like a blade. His sleeve struck Myra's wrist with startling force. The crystal decanter jolted. Wine surged. Mira caught it against her chest, but a splash arced over the rim and landed on the king's coat. A single streak of dark red across midnight fabric. For half a second, time stopped. Then the king's head turned. Storm-gray eyes locked onto her. The temperature in the booth seemed to drop. Mr. Callow, who had been hovering nearby, made a strangled sound. Oh, Your Grace, my deepest apologies, she's new. The king stood. Slowly. Not frantic rage. Worse. Controlled fury. The kind of anger that didn't need to shout because it already believed it had the right to destroy. Mira felt her heart thump once hard. She waited for the humiliation to begin. She'd lived through humiliation. Teachers who assumed she was stupid because she was poor. Employers who smiled while underpaying her. Customers who treated her like furniture. Men who thought kindness was permission. She'd learned the rules. Apologize fast. Shrink small. Don't fight back. But something strange happened inside her when she looked at the stain on his coat, because she realized it hadn't been her mistake. It had been his. And the universe had asked her to pay for it like it always did. The king's voice rose, not a shout but sharp enough to slice. Do you have any comprehension, he said, what you've just done? Mira swallowed. Mr. Callow bowed deeply. Please forgive her, your grace. She's only... Silence, the king said. Mr. Callow went quiet instantly. Myra's fingers stayed steady on the tray because she forced them to. The king's gaze moved to the wine, then to her face. You humans, he said, and the word humans didn't sound like a species. It sounded like an insult disguised as fact. You stumble into sacred spaces and think your clumsiness has no cost. Dorian leaned back, enjoying himself. It's almost charming, he murmured. Even your staff is unreliable. The thin advisor looked panicked. Your grace, perhaps we should. The king didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on Mira. Leave, he said. Before you make it worse. Mira could have nodded and fled. That was the safe choice. But then she saw Mr. Callow's expression, relief. Relief that the blame would fall on her alone. And she remembered her mother's voice in her head years ago, when they were still living in a one-room apartment and the landlord had threatened to lock them out. People only keep taking from you, her mother had whispered. When you keep teaching them, you'll accept it. Mira had learned to accept it. But tonight, something in her refused. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was years of swallowing anger until it became a stone inside her. Maybe it was the way the king spoke about sacred spaces, like kindness didn't count as sacred too. Mira set the decanter down, softly, but deliberately. The sound was small. Yet in that private booth it landed like a gavel. The king paused. Dorian's smile faltered. Mr. Callow's eyes widened like Mira had committed a crime. Mira looked up, straight into storm gray. I didn't spill the wine, she said. Her voice was calm enough to surprise even herself. The king's brow tightened. Excuse me? You moved, Mira continued. You struck my wrist because you were angry at him. She nodded slightly toward Dorian. The thin advisor inhaled sharply like he'd forgotten how. Mr. Callow hissed through his teeth. Mira, stop. Mira didn't stop, because she suddenly understood something. If she apologized for someone else's mistake, she would be doing it for the rest of her life. The king's jaw flexed. The air around him felt heavy, like the room itself was waiting for violence. What is your name? He asked. Mira, she answered. Mira Hale. Dorian chuckled softly. She has a spine. That's new. The king's gaze sharpened. Do you think you can speak to me this way? Mira held his eyes. And something inside her steadied, like a rope finally tied around a wild storm. Yes, she said. Because you're about to make a bigger mistake than a stained coat. The king's expression shifted. Surprise, then danger. You have no concept. Of power? Mira interrupted gently. I do. I see it every day. She pointed, not with her finger but with her words. Managers who threaten employees because they're desperate. Customers who shout because it makes them feel important. Men who think fear is respect. Mr. Callow looked like he might faint. The thin advisor's eyes flicked to the restaurant entrance like he was expecting guards to rush in. Dorian watched Mira like she was a candle he'd like to blow out. The king stepped closer. So close Mira could smell something on him. Cold air, winter stone, and something metallic like old rain. His voice dipped lower. Careful, he warned. You do not know what you're provoking. Myra's heart hammered. But her voice stayed steady. Shout at me again, she said, and this ends? The words left her mouth like they'd been waiting for years. Not dramatic. Not screamed. Just final. For a beat the world stopped. Even the restaurant outside the booth seemed to hold its breath. The king stared at her as if no one had ever spoken to him like that. Dorian's smile vanished. Mr. Callow made a tiny terrified sound. The thin advisor whispered, Oh no. The king's eyes narrowed. Explain, he said. Mira didn't blink. If you raise your voice at me again, she said quietly, I walk out. I quit in front of everyone. And your rival here, she nodded toward Dorian, will make sure the story spreads. Dorian's lips parted, amused again. Now that's an imagination. Mira continued, eyes on the king. They'll say the powerful king of the night court lost control over a human waitress because he couldn't manage a negotiation. They'll say you're unstable. They'll say you punish the weak to impress the strong. Her voice softened. And if you're trying to keep houses loyal to you, that rumor won't help you. The king's stare didn't move, but something changed in it. Not kindness, not softness, recognition. As if Mira had reached through layers of immortality and touched the one thing kings feared more than rebellion: being seen. Dorian leaned forward slightly. Well, he purred. Are you going to prove her right? The king didn't look at him. He looked at Mira. And then, slowly, so slowly it looked impossible, he stepped back. He exhaled. Not frustration. Control. He glanced down at the stain on his sleeve. Then back at her face. You're not afraid, he said like he couldn't understand it. Mira swallowed. I am, she admitted. But I'm more tired than I am afraid. Silence. Then the king did something that made the advisor's knees nearly buckle. He lowered his head just slightly. It wasn't a bow, but it was the closest thing to one the world seemed to expect from him. And in a voice that carried the weight of old laws and older pride, he said, You spoke with the certainty of someone protected by more than courage. Mira's stomach tightened. I don't know what you mean. Dorian's eyes gleamed. The thin advisor whispered, barely audible, No, it can't be. The king's gaze locked onto Mira's throat, just above her collarbone, as if he could see beneath fabric and skin. Mira Hale, he murmured, who taught you those words? Mira felt cold creep up her spine. My grandmother, she said. She said, if a powerful man ever tries to humiliate you for his own loss of control, you remind him that dignity has boundaries. The king's expression hardened. Because it wasn't the lesson that struck him. It was the phrasing, the exactness, the ancient shape of it. Dorian's voice slid into the silence like a knife. Your Grace, tell me you're thinking what I'm thinking. The king's eyes didn't leave Mira. Show me, he said quietly. Mira blinked. Show you what? The advisor's voice trembled. My lord, please. Not here. The king didn't look at him either. Show me, he repeated, calm but absolute, the mark. Mira's breath caught. What mark? She asked. And then she remembered something her grandmother used to do, absent-mindedly, whenever she told stories by the heater. She would touch the base of her neck like she was checking that something was still there. Mira lifted a hand slowly. Her fingers hooked under her collar. Mr. Callow gasped, Stop. Don't. Mira pulled the fabric aside. At first she saw only skin. Then, a faint silver crescent, bisected by a straight line. So pale it could have been a birthmark. Except it shimmered like moonlight trapped under her skin. The air in the booth changed. The candles flickered even though there was no draft. Dorian's smile returned, wider, sharper, thrilled. The advisor staggered back a step. It's real. The king inhaled, once deep, and Mira heard something in it that wasn't human. Not hunger. Not lust. Something older. Something like fear. He stared at the mark as if it was a ghost that had learned how to breathe. The covenant, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Mira's throat went dry. Covenant? Dorian's eyes glittered. Oh, this is magnificent. The king's gaze snapped up to Mira's face. His storm-gray eyes were no longer just angry. They were calculating. Because a king didn't look at a threat like it was a personal insult. A king looked at a threat like it was history repeating. You had no idea, he said softly. Mira shook her head. I don't know what you're talking about. The king's voice became dangerously calm. Then you walked into my territory, he said, carrying an ancient law in your blood, and you just invoked it in front of witnesses. Mira's heart pounded. You're saying I did something illegal? The king's jaw tightened. Not illegal, he corrected. Powerful. Dorian leaned in. And if you don't handle this perfectly, Your Grace, your enemies will call you unworthy. The king ignored him. He stared at Mira as if she had become something else entirely. Not a waitress. Not a servant. Not a weak human. A boundary. A mirror. A test. Mira's voice came out smaller than she wanted. I didn't mean to. I know, the king said, and there was something strange in his tone now, something almost respectful, buried under layers of caution. That's what makes you dangerous. Mira's hands trembled for the first time. I'm not dangerous, she whispered. The king's gaze softened, just slightly, not in romance but in understanding. Not by choice, he said. And then outside the booth the restaurant doors opened again. A cold wind rushed in. And Mira heard footsteps, many footsteps, approaching like a wave. Mr. Callow turned pale. Your Grace, the night court envoy, they weren't supposed to arrive until. The king's voice turned to steel. They heard, he said. Mira's chest tightened. Heard what? The king held her gaze. They heard you, he said. And now the court will want to see whether I punish you, or honor you. Dorian's smile sharpened. Either way, he murmured, someone wins tonight. Myra's stomach dropped, because for the first time she understood. She hadn't just defended herself. She'd stepped into a centuries-old war wearing a brown waitress uniform. And the man in front of her, the vampire king, was no longer deciding whether she deserved respect. He was deciding whether he deserved his throne. The law that never died. The night court did not knock. It never announced itself like something that needed permission. The doors of the Velvet Crescent opened on their own, slow and deliberate, as if the building itself recognized who stood beyond them. Cold air spilled inside, carrying the scent of night rain and old stone. Conversations died instantly. Glasses stopped mid-lift. Music faded into nothing. Mira turned, and understood why fear had rules. They entered in pairs, men and women dressed in black and silver, movements synchronized, expressions unreadable. Their eyes reflected candlelight differently, sharper, brighter, like mirrors polished by centuries. At their center walked an elder woman with hair the color of frost and posture straight as judgment. She did not look at the restaurant. She looked directly at Mira. "Clear the floor," the elder said. Her voice was not loud, yet it moved through the room like gravity. Humans obeyed before they understood they were obeying. Chairs scraped back, people hurried toward the exits, staff pressed flat against walls. Within seconds, the restaurant emptied until only the private booth remained occupied. Myra's knees threatened to give out. The king stepped slightly in front of her, not touching her, not shielding her openly, but positioning himself so that the elder's direct line of sight passed through him first. It was subtle, but it mattered. The elder noticed. Her pale eyes narrowed. "So," she said, stopping 3 paces away, "the rumors are true." Dorian bowed shallowly. "Elder Serapha. What a pleasure." She ignored him completely. Her gaze shifted back to the king. "You raised your voice to a bearer." The king's jaw tightened. "I corrected myself." Serapha tilted her head. After she spoke. "Yes." A murmur rippled through the court members behind her, controlled, restrained, but unmistakably shocked. Serapha's eyes returned to Mira. "You," she said. "Step forward." Myra's breath caught. Before she could move, the king spoke quietly, firmly. "She stays where she is." Serapha's lips curved, not in humor. "Careful, your grace," she said. "The covenant does not belong to you." Mira felt it then, a pressure in the air like invisible hands pulling in opposite directions. The king hesitated, then stepped aside. Not far, but enough. Mira forced her legs to move. Each step toward Serapha felt heavier than the last, like walking through deep water. She stopped where the elder indicated, hands clenched at her sides, heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Serapha studied her slowly. "Name?" "Mira Hale." "Bloodline?" "I don't know." Serapha's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. "That answer," she said, "is proof enough." She turned slightly, addressing the court. The voiceless covenant was created before the night court had a throne. Humans marked by it are not servants. They are balance. Dorian scoffed. "With respect, elder, balance is a poetic word for inconvenience." Serapha's eyes snapped to him, cold and sharp. "And arrogance is often mistaken for strategy." Silence followed. Serapha looked back at Mira. "Did you know what you were invoking when you spoke to him?" Mira swallowed. "No. I only knew what my grandmother taught me." The king's gaze flickered at the word grandmother. Serapha nodded slowly. "Then you acted in purity. Not ambition." She turned to the king again. "Tell me exactly what happened." Every eye moved to him. A vampire king did not explain himself. He justified. He commanded. He erased. But tonight, under laws older than his crown, the king did something rarer. He told the truth. "I lost my temper," he said. "I struck her arm unintentionally. I spoke without restraint. She corrected me." Dorian laughed quietly. "That's one way to describe it." The king ignored him. "I stopped," he continued, "before the law completed itself." Serapha's gaze sharpened. "You did not raise your voice again." "No." "Did you threaten her?" "No." "Did you command punishment?" "No." Serapha held his eyes for a long moment. Then she exhaled. "The throne remains yours," she declared. The tension snapped. Some vampires relaxed, others stiffened in disappointment. Dorian's smile faded. "But," Serapha continued, lifting a finger, "the bearer invoked the covenant publicly. That cannot be undone." Myra's chest tightened. What does that mean? Serapha turned back to her. It means, she said gently, you are no longer invisible. That was not comforting. You will be questioned, Serapha continued. Protected. Watched. By whom? Mira asked. Serapha glanced at the king. By the one who nearly lost everything tonight. The king met Myra's eyes. And for the first time she saw something vulnerable there. Not desire. Not dominance. Responsibility. I will not harm her, he said. I know, Serapha replied. That's why I'm assigning her to you. Dorian stepped forward sharply. You're placing a human covenant bearer under the direct authority of the throne? That's strategic, Serapha interrupted. And inconvenient for anyone hoping to exploit her. Dorian's eyes darkened. Mira felt dizzy. Assigned, how? Serapha smiled faintly. You will reside within the night court until the covenant settles. I can't, Mira said quickly. I have a job. A life. The king spoke softly. That life ended when you spoke those words. The finality in his voice frightened her. I didn't ask for this, she whispered. No, he agreed. You didn't. And something in the way he said it told her he understood that better than anyone. Serapha turned to the court. Prepare the escort. She leaves with us. The room stirred. Guards moved. Myra's hands began to shake. The king noticed. He stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she felt his presence like warmth against winter. You're not being taken, he said quietly. You're being protected. By you? She asked, voice unsteady. Yes. She laughed once, breathless and bitter. You were shouting at me 10 minutes ago. And now, he said, I'm responsible for your safety. She searched his face for mockery. There was none. Only resolve. Serapha observed them both carefully. Interesting, she murmured. You see it already, don't you? The king stiffened. See what? Serapha smiled knowingly. She doesn't fear you the way others do. Mira realized then, it was true. She was scared. But not of him. She was scared of what he represented. Of the world opening too wide too fast. Of being important when she'd spent her whole life being small. The escort assembled. Dark cloaks. Silver sigils. Eyes like stars trapped in shadow. Mira took one last look at the empty restaurant, the life she'd known only hours ago. The king extended his hand. Not commanding. Not possessive. An offer. Come, he said. Before my enemies decide you're easier to kill than to understand. Mira hesitated. Then placed her hand in his. His skin was cool. Steady. And when their fingers touched, something old and unseen shifted. Like a lock turning for the first time in centuries. Dorian watched them with quiet fury. Serapha watched them with something like hope. And Mira, a waitress who had only wanted a quiet shift, walked into the night court beside a vampire king. Unaware that the covenant had not chosen her randomly. It never did. A crown built on silence. The night court did not sleep. It waited. Mira felt that truth the moment the gates closed behind her. They rose from the mountains like a cathedral carved by time itself. Black stone, silver veins glowing faintly under moonlight, spires reaching upward as if the castle were listening to the stars. No torches burned along the walls. The light came from within the stone, pulsing softly, alive in a way that made Myra's skin prickle. She had never seen anything so beautiful. Or so unwelcoming. The escort moved in disciplined silence. No one spoke to her. No one met her eyes. She walked between them like a fragile artifact that might shatter if handled incorrectly. The king walked ahead. Not beside her. Not behind her. Ahead, leading. And somehow that felt safer than either alternative. As they entered the grand hall, the court was already assembled. Hundreds of vampires stood in rising tiers of obsidian steps, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Their whispers formed a low hum, like insects trapped behind glass. Myra's spine straightened automatically. She'd been stared at before. In cheap diners. In crowded buses. In rooms where she didn't belong. But this was different. This wasn't curiosity. This was evaluation. Judgment. Ownership being considered. Human, someone murmured from the crowd. A servant, another voice said. Dangerous, a third whispered. The word wrapped around Myra's chest and squeezed. The king stopped at the foot of the throne platform. He turned. And this time he faced her fully. You will stand here, he said quietly. Mira obeyed. The throne loomed behind him. Obsidian and silver, carved with symbols she didn't recognize but somehow felt in her bones. This was where fear had been refined into tradition. And she, She stood at its edge in borrowed shoes and a brown uniform that screamed how little she belonged. An elder noble stepped forward. Tall, sharp-featured. Gold rings on every finger. "This is unacceptable," he said. A human invoked the covenant in public. Our authority was questioned in front of rivals. Murmurs of agreement rippled outward. The king's voice cut through them. "Authority that cannot withstand correction is tyranny." The hall went still. Mira blinked. That was her argument. The noble sneered. "She humiliated you." "No," the king replied calmly. "She restrained me." The word hit the room like a crack of thunder. Dorian's laughter echoed from the shadows. "Oh, this is delightful," he drawled. "When did humans start teaching kings how to rule?" The king did not look at him. He looked at Mira. "You will speak," he said. Her breath caught. "Me?" "Yes." The court stirred. Myra's hands trembled, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "I didn't mean to embarrass anyone," she said. "I didn't even know this place existed." A ripple of disdain passed through the nobles. She continued anyway. "All I know is that when powerful people lose control, someone weaker always pays the price. Tonight that was almost me." Silence followed. Not rejection. Consideration. The king turned to the court. "This," he said, "is why the covenant existed." Dorian stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "Or," he countered, "it exists to shackle power when it becomes inconvenient." The king's eyes hardened. "Power is always inconvenient when it's accountable." Dorian smiled thinly. "Careful, Val, your grace. You sound changed." The word lingered. "Changed." The court murmured again, louder this time. Mira felt something dangerous building, not anger but pressure. She saw it in the way several nobles leaned forward, in the way whispers sharpened. They weren't afraid of her. They were afraid of what she represented. The king lifted one hand. The hall fell silent. "She will remain under my protection," he said. "Any harm done to her will be treated as an attack on the throne." That shocked them. Mira felt it like a wave, eyes widening, breath hitching, power shifting. Dorian's gaze snapped to the king. "You're tying your reign to a mortal?" "I'm tying it to restraint," the king replied. Serapha stepped forward from the shadows. "And restraint," she said, "is what has been missing." The court stilled at her presence. Serapha turned to Mira. "You will stay here. You will observe. You will speak when asked." Mira nodded, unsure what else to do. "And," Serapha added softly, "you will learn who you are." The court dispersed reluctantly. Mira was escorted through winding corridors of stone and light, her thoughts spiraling. This wasn't a palace. It was a test. At last she was shown into a quiet chamber, simple by court standards but larger than any place she'd ever lived. A single window overlooked the mountains. Moonlight spilled across a low bed and a small table. She sank onto the edge of the mattress, hands shaking now that no one was watching. A knock sounded. She stiffened. The door opened. The king entered alone. He did not wear his crown. Without it he looked different. Still powerful. Still immortal. But less like a symbol and more like a man carrying too much weight. "I should apologize," he said. Mira looked up, startled. "You already?" "No," he interrupted gently. "Not as a king." He met her eyes. "As a person." Her throat tightened. "I shouldn't have raised my voice. I shouldn't have struck you. Intent doesn't matter." She stared at him. No one in power had ever said that to her. Ever. "I accept," she said quietly. He nodded once. Then hesitated. "Why didn't you back down?" he asked. "Most would have." Mira looked toward the window. "Because if I had," she said, "I would have hated myself more than I feared you." The honesty landed between them, raw and unpolished. The king studied her like she was a puzzle he didn't want to solve too quickly. "You don't crave power," he said. "No," she replied. "I crave dignity." Something shifted in his expression. Respect. Not romantic. Not possessive. A sudden sharp pain hit him. He staggered, hand gripping the table. Mira jumped to her feet. "What's wrong?" He straightened too quickly. "Nothing." But she saw it. The way his breath went shallow. The way his jaw tightened. "Sit," she said. He blinked. "That's not." "Sit," she repeated, firmer. To the shock of both of them. He obeyed. She knelt in front of him, eyes scanning his face. "You're poisoned," she said. His eyes snapped to hers. "Explain." "I don't know how," she admitted. "But I've seen this before. My grandmother, she worked in old hospitals. She used to say powerful men ignore pain until it becomes deadly. She pressed her fingers lightly against his wrist. His pulse was uneven. This isn't magic, she continued. It's slow, subtle, meant to weaken you quietly. Dorian. The name burned in her mind. The king exhaled slowly. You should not know this. Mira met his gaze. I save people, she said simply. That's always been my role. Something ancient stirred in the air. The mark at her collarbone warmed faintly. The king looked at her, not as a subject, not as a threat, but as something rare. An equal truth in a world of lies. Outside the chamber, unseen eyes watched. Dorian smiled in the darkness. Because now he knew. The covenant had not only bound the king. It had chosen his greatest weakness. And his greatest protection. The cost of protection. The poison did not burn. That was what made it deadly. It moved through the king's blood like patience. Slow, deliberate, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. Mira felt it beneath her fingers as clearly as if it were her own pulse faltering. Too even. Too controlled. Like something pretending to be stability. You need rest, she said quietly. And you need witnesses you trust. The king watched her from the chair, storm-gray eyes sharp despite the pain. If I summon healers now, he said, Dorian will know his attempt succeeded. Myra's jaw tightened. Then we don't summon healers. Silence stretched between them, heavy with risk. You're asking me to let myself weaken, he said. I'm asking you to let the court reveal itself, she replied. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he nodded. The next morning the court gathered under false calm. It was announced as a routine assembly, trade routes, border disputes, ceremonial affirmations. Nothing that would raise suspicion. Dorian arrived smiling, confident, dressed in black edged with crimson like a man already attending a victory feast. Mira stood at the edge of the dais, positioned behind the throne. She could feel eyes on her, curious, hostile, calculating. She wore a simple dark dress now, provided by Serapha, but it did nothing to quiet the whispers. The king took his seat. Too slowly. Dorian noticed. Mira saw it in the flicker of satisfaction that crossed his face. My king, Dorian began smoothly, before we discuss trade, I believe the court deserves reassurance. Rumors spread quickly. Some say you've changed. Murmurs rippled outward. The king rested one arm on the throne, his posture composed, but Mira saw the strain beneath it. Rumors, the king replied evenly, are often the refuge of cowards. Dorian laughed softly. Or the warnings of the observant. He stepped closer to the dais. Perhaps, Dorian continued, your judgment has been compromised by your attachment. He gestured toward Mira. Several nobles leaned forward. The trap was being set. Mira stepped out from behind the throne. Gasps followed. Careful, she said, voice calm but carrying. You're speaking about a king who hasn't been allowed to heal. The hall froze. Dorian's smile sharpened. Heal? From what? Mira turned to the court. From poison, she said. Chaos erupted instantly. Shouts. Accusations. Movement. The king rose halfway from the throne before pain caught him. Mira was at his side in an instant, one hand steadying him, the other raised. Enough, she said. The word echoed, ancient, binding. The room went still. Serapha stepped forward slowly, eyes blazing. Explain yourself, child. Mira met her gaze. The poison was administered over days. Tasteless. Odorless. Designed to weaken, not kill, so that when the king faltered, his enemies could question his authority. Her eyes shifted deliberately to Dorian. And so one man could step forward as the solution. Dorian chuckled. Accusations from a human with no proof? Mira reached into the folds of her sleeve and withdrew a small crystal vial. I kept the decanter, she said. From the night at the restaurant. I noticed residue where there shouldn't have been any. She held it up. The crystal shimmered, then darkened. A collective intake of breath swept the hall. Serapha's voice turned lethal. Court alchemists. They rushed forward, testing the vial. Their verdict was immediate. Poison, one confirmed. Ancient. Court grade. Eyes turned. Not toward Mira. Toward Dorian. His smile finally cracked. You would condemn me on her word? He snapped. No, the king said quietly. Everyone looked at him. He straightened, pain etched into his features but authority unbroken. We condemn you on pattern, the king continued. On ambition disguised as concern. On patience that reeks of entitlement. Dorian's gaze flicked around the room, searching for allies. He found none. Serapha raised her staff. Dorian of House Vale, you are charged with treason. Dorian laughed once, sharp and bitter. You think this ends with me? Guards moved. Mira watched him carefully. Maybe not, she said softly. But it ends today. Dorian's eyes locked on hers, hatred, disbelief, and something else beneath it. Fear. He was taken. The court erupted into noise again, but this time it wasn't chaos. It was relief. The king swayed. Mira caught him before he fell. In front of everyone. The court watched as a human steadied their ruler without hesitation, without permission. Serapha bowed her head slightly. A gesture not meant for the king. Meant for Mira. Take him to the inner chambers, Serapha ordered. Now. Later, in the quiet that followed healing magic and bitter remedies, the king lay resting, color slowly returning to his skin. Mira sat nearby, exhausted, hands folded in her lap. You saved my life, he said softly. I told you, she replied. That's what I do. He studied her face, the strength, the fatigue, the quiet courage. You chose me over safety, he said. She shook her head. I chose what was right. He was silent for a long moment. Then, that's why the Covenant chose you. Mira looked at him. And that, he continued, voice low and certain, is why I will choose you too. Not as a ruler. Not as a weapon. But as something the Night Court had forgotten how to honor. A conscience. Outside, the court adjusted. Inside, something deeper shifted, slow, careful, undeniable. Not love. Not yet. But trust. And in a world built on fear, that was the most dangerous bond of all. What the throne chose. The Night Court had survived the night. But it would never be the same. Word spread quickly, faster than shadows, faster than fear. A human had stood before the throne. A traitor had been exposed without bloodshed. A king had been weakened, and protected, by the very person his world taught him to overlook. By dawn, the court gathered again. Not by command. By necessity. Mira stood beside the king as the hall filled, her heart steady in a way it had never been before. She no longer felt small. Not powerful either. Just present. Serapha stepped forward, staff striking the obsidian floor once. The Covenant awakens fully today, she announced. And with it the final law. A hush fell. Mira felt warmth at her collarbone, gentle, insistent. Serapha turned to her. Mira Hale, bearer of the voiceless Covenant. You have fulfilled its first purpose, restraint. Mira swallowed. What's the second? Serapha's gaze shifted to the king. Choice. The word echoed. The king's posture straightened. Serapha continued, the Covenant exists to test rulers when power forgets humility. If the bearer proves worthy, the throne is given a chance to choose differently. Dorian's absence felt loud. So what happens now? Mira asked. Serapha lifted her chin. Now the king must decide. Every eye turned. The king rose slowly from the throne. His voice carried without effort. For 3 centuries, he said, this court has ruled through fear disguised as order. I believed restraint was weakness. He looked at Mira. I was wrong. Murmurs rippled outward. The Covenant does not demand my abdication, he continued. It demands my evolution. Dissent stirred. An elder noble stepped forward. And if the court rejects this change? The king's eyes hardened. Then the court proves the Covenant necessary. Silence followed. Serapha nodded once. The law is clear. The king may retain the throne, only if he binds himself to the Covenant's living bearer. Mira's breath caught. Bind, how? Serapha smiled softly. Not ownership. Partnership. The court erupted, outrage, disbelief, fury. The king raised his hand. They fear what they cannot control, he said. So did I. He turned to Mira. This choice is not mine alone, he said quietly. If you refuse, the Covenant will withdraw. I will rule as before, or fall trying to be better. Mira's chest tightened. She looked at the court, the same power that would have crushed her weeks ago. Then at the king, not a god, not a monster. A man who had learned to listen. I won't be your shield, she said softly. And I won't be your excuse. His lips curved faintly. I wouldn't insult you by asking. She stepped closer. But I will stand beside you, she continued, voice strengthening. Not because you're a king. Because you're trying. The mark at her collarbone flared, silver, radiant. The hall gasped. Serapha struck her staff again. The Covenant binds. Light rippled outward, not violent, not blinding. Warm. Steady. The throne hummed, not in rejection but in acceptance. The king exhaled slowly. And then he stepped down. Gasps echoed. He descended the dais and stood level with Mira. No crown. No elevation. Just equality. In this court, he said, voice firm and clear, no voice will be raised to silence another. Power will answer to dignity. And I will be judged, every day, by the one who reminded me what restraint means. He looked at her, not with possession. With respect. The court bowed. Not to fear. To change. Later, as dawn crept across the mountains, Mira stood on the balcony overlooking a world that no longer felt unreachable. You could have ruled alone, she said quietly. The king stood beside her. I did. And it nearly destroyed everything. She smiled faintly. You know this doesn't make things easier. I know, he replied. But it makes them right. Silence settled between them, not awkward. Comfortable. Slow. This doesn't mean romance, Mira said softly. No, he agreed. It means trust. She glanced at him. That's rarer. He met her gaze. And far more dangerous. The sun rose. The night court endured. And a waitress who refused to be humiliated became the boundary that saved a kingdom, not by force, not by fear, but by reminding power that respect is not given. It is chosen. The end.